I'm here as the news editor at Ballotpedia. And thanks so much for your patience as we got these issues resolved. And then joining us for the third week of our election week brief, which have been discussing the results of the 2020 elections. So all of us at Ballotpedia, as you know, have been following these races, analyzing the data. There's still quite a lot to be counted, believe it or not. And more results are coming into focus, but more and more results will come into focus in the coming days and weeks. On Wednesday, we looked at things just 24 hours out. On Thursday, we looked at ballot measures. Today, we wanted to do a look at state level and down ballot races, basically those elections outside of the federal level. And to analyze those with me today is David Lukes, who is the team lead on the Marquee team. So Dave, thanks so much for joining us today.
Happy to be here, Dave. Technical gremlins or no?
Yeah, it's this is the environment that we're all living in. So again, I apologize and thank you for your patience. So in looking, just want to do something off the top when we talk about our policy for calling elections. Recognize that we have adopted a policy in terms of how we are calling races that rely on a consensus of 5 major media outlets. Those 5 national outlets are ABC News, CNN, Fox News, NBC News, and the New York Times. So when we talk about throughout this webinar races that have been called or not called, and that's of course for the top ballot races, some of the lower races, some of the state level chambers and whatnot, we have a slightly different policy, but we're still looking for that consensus. We're not just going to call a race based on, just one individual outlet. So we had 44 states that held elections for control of one or more branches of government this week, and this is at the state level. There were 44 state legislative elections for either one or both chambers, and 11 gubernatorial elections. So let's start with the top, and let's talk about the gubernatorial elections. So what can you tell us about the results of those, Dave?
Yeah, so the big theme, Dave, in this year's gubernatorial elections was continuity rather than change. So 9 of the 11 races had the state's current governor, the incumbent, running for re-election. And I want to focus on those 9 first. All 9 of those governors, 6 of them Republican, 3 of them Democratic, won re-election. So that leaves us 2 states with open races for governor. Those are Utah and Montana. Now, very briefly, I want to touch on Utah first. Utah's current governor is Republican Gary Herbert. He is the longest serving governor currently in office. He took office way back in 2009 after President Obama appointed then Governor John Huntsman ambassador to China. Now, Governor Herbert could have run for another term, but he chose not to. His lieutenant governor, Spencer Cox, ran instead, emerged from a relatively crowded GOP field in the primaries. And we can now say, we've called this race, we can now say Spencer Cox is going to win the election to succeed Gary Herbert. This is the 11th election in a row that Utah Republicans have won at the gubernatorial level. No Democrat has won election as governor of Utah since 1980. And this is actually, for us stats nerds, this is a really interesting result. This is now officially the nation's longest currently ongoing gubernatorial winning streak. Before the election, Utah Republicans were actually tied with Oregon Democrats. They had both won 10 elections in a row. This now brings Utah Republicans up to 11. It's going to be up to the Oregon Democrats in 2022 to see if they can match that. But for now, this is the longest winning streak currently ongoing.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and we've done analyses of that, I think, throughout the year, just looking at that, and with so many governor's races up in 2022, that'll be an interesting thing that we'll be focusing on as we pivot towards those. You're saving that one that you're saving for last, which was the one gubernatorial race that did flip. So Republican Greg Gianforte won the gubernatorial election in Montana. And he is the first Republican. We think of Montana, sometimes some people think of it as a red state, but he will be the first Republican to win the governorship since the year 2000. So can you tell us a little bit about that race?
Yeah, so Montana's current governor is Democrat Steve Bullock, and he was term limited this year. He briefly ran for president, then he ended up joining the US Senate race, and he's lost that race to the incumbent Steve Daines. So this year, Democrats nominated Bullock's Lieutenant Governor Mike Cooney as their Democratic gubernatorial nominee. The Republicans nominated Greg Gianforte. Now, he is the current US representative for Montana, but he was also the Republican nominee for governor last time around in 2016. And that year, when he was up against Steve Bullock, Bullock won that race 50% to 46% over Greg Gianforte. And it looks like Gianforte has reversed that this year.
And so, I mean, this is a little bit of a different race than 2016. Obviously, Bullock was the incumbent at that time, having been first elected in 2012. What else was different about this race compared to 2016?
Well, we don't have the final numbers in just yet, but Gianforte appears to have won by a substantially larger margin this year than Bullock did in 2016. So again, Bullock won 50% to 46%. Gianforte, based on the preliminary results, has won 54% to 42%. This is also a really impactful win because Republicans already had majorities in both chambers of the Montana state legislature. So Gianforte's win gives them a trifecta. And this is particularly interesting because Montana actually hasn't had a trifecta ever since Democrats started their trend of winning the governorship back in 2004. Out of the 14 states that currently don't have a trifecta, none has been without a trifecta for longer than Montana. So Republicans picking the trifecta up there, this is a pretty big change in Montana state politics.
Yes, and I said, some people think of Montana as a red state. It's, actually, I probably should have checked myself. I think Montana traditionally votes Republican at the presidential level, but they have Senator John Tester, who has been, representing that state as a Democrat in the U.S. Senate. So statewide, Democrats, have had success there, and tends to be a little bit of a swing state at the state level, either for Senate or some of the other offices. But those are all some very interesting facts. All right. Now, one of the things that we always want to take a look at when the election is over is what does the landscape look like? We only have, as you mentioned, 11 gubernatorial races, and there was only that one change. So heading into the elections, Republicans had a slight majority. They had 26 gubernatorial offices to the 24 held by Democrats. That one change now makes that 27 to 23. So really not much change, only 11 races up. And as I alluded to before, 2022, I think there's something like 37 or 38 gubernatorial seats will be up. So that'll be a different dynamic completely. Now let's move a little bit further down the ballot as we promised, and let's look at the lieutenant governor races. What can you tell us about any of those elections?
Yeah, so there were 9 states that held elections for lieutenant governor this year. 4 of those states, and that 4 does include Montana, have this as part of the gubernatorial election. The lieutenant governor runs on a ticket with the governor, much like how at the federal level, the vice president runs on a ticket with the president. So the governor election result determined the lieutenant governor. But the remaining 5 states have it as a separate office. It's elected on its own. And of those 5, there was one sort of partisan flip, and this took place in Vermont. And this is possible because Vermont has fusion voting, where candidates can run for the office with multiple partisan affiliations. So Vermont's current lieutenant governor is David Zuckerman. He was elected as a progressive, that's his primary party affiliation. But when he was elected as lieutenant governor, he also had the support from the Democratic Party. He was the Democratic candidate as well. Now this year, Zuckerman didn't run for re-election as lieutenant governor, he ran for governor instead. And the Democrats and the progressives nominated different candidates for the lieutenant governor. And in this case, the Democratic candidate actually won, Molly Gray. So sort of the overall look at lieutenant governorships this year, Republicans flipped the lieutenant governorship in Montana from Democrats. Democrats flipped the lieutenant governorship in Vermont from progressives.
All right. So again, not much change. Just one or two changes, and obviously the one in Montana having to do with the combined ticket. All right. Let's keep moving a little bit further down the ballot as we go. And 10 states elected an attorney general this year. And what do we know? Do we know the results of those? Have any of those flipped?
Yeah, so just to quickly set the landscape, those 10 states, they're evenly divided. 5 had a Republican attorney general, 5 had a Democratic attorney general. So far, we've been able to call 7 of those races. None of those were flips. The 3 that are outstanding are North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Washington. All 3 of these are states where Democrats currently hold the Attorney General's seat. So there could be as many as 3 flips to Republicans, but so far, based on what we've been able to call, there's been no movement whatsoever on the Attorney General front.
Okay. And then obviously we'll have that information about those 3 states, in the coming days and weeks. Now we're gonna get down to the next office, and that's the Secretary of State's office. And it kind of leads me into a little bit of an introduction of a term we use called triplex, which refers to a state where the same party has control of the governor's office, Attorney General, and Secretary of State. Because in a lot of cases, those 3 positions have very clearly defined policy responsibilities. So there were Secretary of State elections in some states this year. How many of them were up, and has there been any significant result?
So there were 7 Secretary of State offices up this year. 5 of those were held by Republicans, 2 by Democrats. So far, we've been able to call both of the Democratic races are remaining in Democratic hands. Of the 5 Republican offices, 3 of them are remaining in Republican hands. There's 2 that are outstanding, Oregon and Washington. I'll start with Oregon. Oregon is actually a flip. We've been able to call this as a flip from Republicans to Democrats. Democrat Shemia Fagan defeated 3 others, including Republican Kim Thatcher, to flip the Secretary of State's office. And this is a particularly interesting race because Oregon's Secretary of State is not just the top elections administrator, but is also the official who is first in line to the governorship. Oregon actually does not have a lieutenant governor. And Oregon's current governor, Democrat Kate Brown, she was Secretary of State before succeeding to the governorship when John Kitzhaber resigned in 2015. Now in Washington, which is another Republican-held Secretary of State's office, this race still remains too close to call. The incumbent Republican Secretary of State, Kim Wyman, is running against Democrat Gail Tarleton. This is a really interesting race, mostly because of the landscape around control of statewide offices in Washington. On the one hand, either result would really be historic. On the one hand, if Tarleton wins, she would be actually the first Democrat elected as Washington Secretary of State since 1960. On the other hand, if Kim Wyman wins, this is a really crucial hold for Republicans because the Secretary of State's office is one of just 2 statewide offices alongside the state treasurer that Washington Republicans still hold. This race is too close to call, but currently Wyman appears to be in the lead. She seems poised to win that 3rd term.
All right, all of this is fantastic. All right, so we've talked about the down ballot races: governor, lieutenant governor, attorney general, secretary of state. We talked about triplexes. Going into the election, just to set the stage, we had 19 states had Republican triplexes, 16 had Democratic triplexes, and 14 were neither. And so based on all of the results that have happened that we've just talked about over the last several minutes, how has the 2020 elections changed that?
Yeah, so based on just the races we've been able to call, Republicans and Democrats both have picked up 1 new triplex from that pool of 14 states without a triplex. So that's Greg Gianforte flipping the governorship in Montana, is where Republicans get their triplex. Democrats get theirs from Shemia Fagan flipping the Secretary of State's office in Oregon. Now, there are 4 states where we're not going to be calling triplexes anytime soon, and this is because either the Attorney General or the Secretary of State, in one case actually both, are appointed by either the governor or by the new state legislature. These are appointments that typically happen in December or January, and we're going to be waiting to see who those new office holders are before calling those triplexes. So just to set the stage, that's 2 states with a Democratic triplex currently, 1 with a Republican triplex, 1 without a triplex. Those 4 are up in the air. We're anticipating they will be for some time. There's also 2 more states that we haven't called that we're hoping we're going to be able to call a little bit more soon. And that's because we're waiting on final election results. And I actually misspoke. It's 3 states, not 2. Washington, which doesn't currently have a triplex, and then North Carolina and Pennsylvania, which both have Democratic triplexes.
All right, so basically Republicans held on to 18 of their 19 triplexes and one is up in the air. And then of course they gained one with the Montana situation as you talked about. On the Democratic side, they've definitely held on to 12. They started with 16, they definitely held on to 12. There are 4 up in the air and they've definitely gained the 1 in Oregon. So, you know, obviously each state, the dynamics are a little bit different and its impact on policy depending on the responsibilities of these positions, but that kind of gives you a general sense of what these results of these down ballot offices. All right, so we've talked about triplexes, but there's another term that we also use, and that's trifectas. And that also plays into the results at the state level, either with the state legislature or the governor's race. So as a reminder to everybody, a state government trifecta is when one party controls both the state's governorship and they have majorities in both chambers of the state legislature. So we've talked about the gubernatorial races that happened. There were 11 of those, but there were also 44 states that held state legislative elections. So, you know, surely there was some news relating to that landscape. What can you tell us about those?
Yeah, so first, just to kind of continue setting the stage, there were 86 state legislative chambers across 44 states holding elections. We're able to call 83 of them right now. There's still 3 that are too close to call. That's the Alaska State House and then the Arizona State Senate and House. Of the 83 chambers that we can call, 81 of them didn't flip. There were only 2 flips. And that's the New Hampshire State Senate and House, which Republicans have flipped from Democrats. And because Republican Governor Chris Sununu won re-election in New Hampshire, Republicans have gained a trifecta in New Hampshire. And if we look at the New Hampshire gain versus the Republican trifecta gain in Montana, in a lot of ways, they're kind of sort of opposites from one another in that the New Hampshire trifecta gain is ending a very brief period of divided government. Montana was under divided government for a long period of time. However, in New Hampshire, Republicans had a trifecta up until the 2018 elections. So this will be ending a 2-year period of no trifectas. But none of the 81 other state legislative chambers that we've looked at have flipped.
You know, that last point is really, really fascinating. And I did a talk yesterday where the folks were just astonished at that, because we always talk about elections, especially high turnout elections, as you know, periods where there's a fair amount of normal change, and yet here it appears there was, you know, far less than normal change. So you know, I know Ballotpedia had identified 24 state legislative chambers that were battlegrounds going into this election, and in 23 we thought that the chamber had a chance to flip, and in reality only 2 of those have flipped in New Hampshire, as you mentioned. And I know we were talking that according to the National Conference of State Legislatures, this is the fewest number of chamber flips in an even numbered year, meaning you know, either a presidential race or a midterm, since 1944. And that year there were even 4 flips, and here we've only got 2. Now, obviously, those 3 are still outstanding, so I guess it's possible that number gets up to 5. But again, I think that's an important takeaway as far as how these elections went. So let's look at the big picture now that we've talked about all the components. We've mentioned the governors, we've talked about state legislatures. So what impact did these elections this week have on, you know, overall trifecta control?
Yeah, so just to set the stage here, heading into the election, there were 21 states where Republicans had a trifecta, 15 states where Democrats had a trifecta, and then 14 with divided government, meaning neither party had a trifecta. And because of those uncalled legislative chambers in Alaska and in Arizona, we still can't really call those states trifecta statuses. Arizona was a Republican trifecta heading into the election. Neither party had a trifecta in Alaska. Both of those states actually have Republican governors who aren't going to be up for re-election until 2022. This means that Democrats have no chance to gain a trifecta in either state. And kind of the outstanding lingering question right now is, will Republicans gain a trifecta in Alaska? Will they lose their trifecta in Arizona? But setting all of that aside, we can definitely say that Republicans have absolutely gained 2 trifectas in states that were under divided government, Montana and New Hampshire. And we can very definitively say that Democrats have held on to all 15 of their existing trifectas, but have not gained any new ones.
All right, so the final trifecta count depends entirely on what goes on in Alaska and Arizona. So what are the different scenarios that exist there?
So if Republicans pick up a trifecta in Alaska while also holding their trifecta in Arizona, they will have gained a net of 3 trifectas. That's going to leave them with 24 trifectas. If they lose their trifecta in Arizona and don't gain one in Alaska, they're still going to end up ahead because they flipped trifectas in Montana and New Hampshire. So they'll end up with 22 versus 21 before the election. A split result where they succeed in one state and not in the other would leave Republicans with 23 trifectas. No matter how you slice it, though, either way, these are historically high numbers of states under single party government. Depending on the results in Alaska and Arizona, there are going to be somewhere between 37 and 39 state government trifectas after the election is over and the dust settles. Now, our tracking of historical trifectas goes back to 1992. In that period of time, our all-time high was 37 trifectas in the 2-year period after the 2012 election. So regardless of what happens in Alaska or Arizona, we are going to match or exceed that number.
Yeah, that's very interesting, because one of the narratives that's come out in the media relating to this election was just, the presence of a divided electorate. And this would tend to support this on an office holder level. Obviously, there's a lot of different elements of that and different components of that. But just certainly from a standpoint of chamber control and having that be aligned with the governor's race or the governor's office in that state, we have a historically high number where that is all with one party or all with the other. Now, all of this talk about partisan control of state government is important any year related to the policy initiatives that happen at the state level, but we also have this thing called redistricting, which is going to be a big topic in 2021. And obviously, in many places, the partisan control of state governments determines who is involved in drawing the district lines after the census. So I know there's enough complexities for about redistricting to be its own discussion. We probably will have multiple sets of those over the course of 2021 as all of that becomes into focus. But Dave, can you give us basically a top level overview of what this all means related to redistricting?
Yeah, so this is the very basic overview, not really accounting for a lot of the state by state complexities, as you say. But the kind of view from 30,000 feet is that all 50 states are going to be drawing new state legislative district lines after the census is completed. And there are also 43 states that are going to draw new congressional district lines. There are 7 states that just have a single US House seat, so no need to redistrict there. We'll start with congressional redistricting. There are actually 35 states where the power to draw congressional district maps lies with the state legislature. After the 2020 elections, partisan control of those states breaks down to 17 Republican trifectas. That includes their new trifecta in New Hampshire, 9 Democratic trifectas. Then there are 6 states that have a Republican state legislature, but they also have a Democratic governor who could potentially veto a district map. There are 2 states that have the opposite situation. They have a Democratic state legislature and a Republican governor who could potentially veto a district map. And the last state is Minnesota, which has a divided legislature where Republicans control the state Senate and Democrats the state House. Minnesota's governor is a Democrat. The numbers for state legislative redistricting are fairly similar. It's 36 states rather than 35 where the state legislature draws state legislative district maps. And it's not the exact same set of states in each category, but those states do end up breaking down to the same overall top line numbers, just with a 10th state under Democratic trifecta control.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And like I said, these state level elections often have big implications both at the policy level and maybe the shorter term, and as we've seen in the past several cycles with redistricting in these particular years that end with a 0. But if you're interested in redistricting and how it all plays out, please, stay with us throughout the entirety of the next 12 to 18 months, because it's going to be a very hot topic. All right, we're very close to end of time, but I know you wanted to talk about one noteworthy local election result. and we talked a lot about the state level and the down ballot races, but there were some local election results that we were also identified as battleground races. So, you know, is there any of those you can show us, shed a little bit of light on?
Yeah, there's one that actually I just received the call in from our elections team just a couple minutes before we started this webinar, and that is the election for mayor in Portland, Oregon. So here we have incumbent Ted Wheeler. He is running against Sarah Iannarone and a write-in candidate, Teresa Reifert. This was a really interesting race. They had the nonpartisan primary way back in May. If Wheeler was able to clear the 50% vote mark, he would have been able to win re-election outright. He got 49.1%, falling just short. And in terms of kind of where local groups were offering their support, Wheeler had support from the local branches of the SEIU and the NAACP, as well as the Portland Business Alliance. Iannarone's supporters included the Oregon Progressive Party and Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders. And we have just gotten the call that Ted Wheeler has won re-election. This is particularly interesting because it makes him the first mayor of Portland, Oregon to win re-election since all the way back in 2000. So really interesting result there.
All right, very, very, very interesting, and also, you know, late breaking news. And we've all been living this for the last 2 or 3 days. And so thank you for giving us this last minute information. So thank you for all of this great information, this great wrap up of everything at the state level, the down ballot races, what's the impact on triplex and trifecta control, and even that local race here. So thanks so much for all this information, Dave.
Thanks for having me, Dave. Always a pleasure.
All right. So again, you know, as I mentioned at the top of the briefing, we are still in the process, as you saw just right then and there, in continuing to review results and getting information about races that are being called. So we're going to be continuing to analyze all of this information as the results come in, as we get more and more of them. And as we publish those, you'll find all of that information at ballotpedia.org. And that's also where you can find links to summaries of results and the latest information about the elections themselves, any news developments afterwards. And of course, I know I keep teasing this, but as we head into the new year, the big stories that'll be happening, including redistricting and the 2022 elections. Now, if you want this great information to be delivered to you, we have our regular menu of newsletters, which includes our daily news summary, The Brew, and our weekly recap, The Tap. There's links on our homepage to our full listing of newsletters on a variety of different topics. And from there, you can review samples of those or subscribe to whichever ones you like. So thank you very much for joining us, and have a great weekend.